Charting Toward Intimacy covers mature topics. Listener discretion is advised. Did you know that prayer and sexual desire are extremely connected, and that we can actually learn a lot from prayer to help us in the area of sexual desire? When we realize that sexual desire is so much more than the physical impulse that our society often reduces sexual desire to, we are able to unite in a more full way with our spouse. And also, we can learn to desire sex on a much deeper level. That is what we are going to be talking about today. Welcome to Charting Toward Intimacy, the sex and intimacy podcast for Catholic women. My name is Ellen Holloway, and I am a Catholic speaker and coach who specializes in sex and marital intimacy. And I am on a mission to help you actually enjoy and desire good, holy sex with your spouse. So a few days ago, I was reading part of the Catechism on prayer, and I came across a quote that I then shared on my Instagram stories. Apparently, it resonated because I've legitimately never received so much feedback from a story post before. So I thought I would expand on what I said in my Instagram stories in this week's podcast episode. What I read in the Catechism was paragraph 2650. Prayer cannot be reduced to the spontaneous outpouring of interior impulse. In order to pray, one must have the will to pray. The paragraph in the Catechism continues, but that sentence is what I want to focus on. So, what is the Catechism saying here? It's saying, look, prayer doesn't just happen. You have to work at it. You're not just going to randomly desire to pray enough. Yes, sometimes you will have a desire to pray or an interior impulse, as the Catechism uses, but that is just the surface level, really. In order to really pray, you have to have the will to pray. In order to really pray, you have to want it on a deeper level than just an interior impulse. You have to will to build that relationship with God. And sometimes you're going to have to use that will to pray even when you don't really feel like it. And even more so, what this paragraph is saying, I really like how this sentence in this paragraph uses the word reduce. Prayer cannot be reduced to that spontaneous desire to pray, that interior impulse. Prayer cannot be reduced to the spontaneous outpouring of interior impulse. That's what the Catechism specifically says there. And that is really bold. And we can really take this sentence and just pray with this for a few holy hours, honestly. I myself often reduce prayer to only when I want to, only when I have that spontaneous outpouring. But this is a sex and intimacy podcast. Why are we talking about prayer? Well, sex and prayer have some beautiful connections. First off, let's go back to what sex really is, what sex is really doing. When man and woman come together in that marital embrace, they are an image of the relationship that God wants to have with us. Man and woman image the relationship of creator with created, of giver with receiver. We come together in sex to give the full gift of ourself, and we receive the gift of our spouse. We are learning about the relationship that God wants to have with us. He has already given the full gift of himself, and he did that on the cross. And he desires for us to accept that gift, and in accepting, in receiving that gift, so becoming our gift ourselves. And Mary is a perfect image of this perfect reception of the full gift of God, and so becoming a gift of herself. Mary received the gift of God and then became pregnant with Jesus. She became a gift of self by receiving the gift. That is what is happening in sex when husband and wife come together as full gifts of self. We are creating this image of the relationship God wants with us. And we're also learning about that relationship that God wants with us and learning how to grow in that relationship. All this is happening while we are also growing closer to our spouse and learning how to grow in that physical relationship. There are so many layers to what sex really is and what it really does. Now, let's look at something else that helps us grow in our relationship with God. Prayer. That is literally how we grow in relationship with God. Something else the Catechism says so well is that prayer is always a response. God already initiated, and it is our job to respond in prayer, to respond to his invitation, and to grow in relationship with God. Prayer is giving of ourselves. Cardinal Ratzinger, quoting the Church Fathers, said that prayer is nothing other than becoming a longing for God. Prayer is opening up and giving ourselves over to God to become a longing for him. Are you seeing the connections here? Prayer is an exchange with God that involves self-gift. We are receiving the initiation of God and then responding in prayer by giving ourselves to God. Sex is an exchange with another human that involves self-gift. We are both giving and receiving at the same time. We are receiving the gift of our spouse, and in that receiving, we are becoming a gift ourselves. Women in particular get this image of receiving first and giving second a little easier because of the function of our biology, that we're receiving the gift of the man, the gift of his sperm into ourselves, and by receiving that gift, we are becoming a self-gift. This happens in a very visible way in pregnancy, but this doesn't just apply to pregnancy. Every time that a husband and wife come together in love, there is a giving of self and a receiving of the other. Really quick, before we get on with the rest of the episode, I just wanted to ask you that if this podcast has blessed you in any way, or you've learned something from this podcast, would you please rate and review this podcast? The reviews in particular really help people find this podcast and benefit from it. So I would be so grateful if you would rate and review the podcast. So let's go back to that quote from the Catechism. Prayer cannot be reduced to the spontaneous outpouring of interior impulse. In order to pray, one must have the will to pray. We've established some of the similarities between prayer and sex. So we can take this quote now and we can apply it to sex and desire for sex. Desire for sex cannot be reduced to the spontaneous outpouring of interior physical impulse. In order to achieve full unity of man and woman, one must have the will to unite with his or her spouse. So what does that mean? If we can't reduce prayer to spontaneous desire for it, why is it that we reduce desire for sex only to the spontaneous physical desire for sex? That doesn't make any sense considering what we know about sex. We know that sex is not just a physical act. So why do we reduce desire for sex to a merely physical desire? But I hear this so often. My libido is just gone. I never really want to have sex. I never feel like having sex. My husband always wants sex and I never do. I only ever want sex during my fertile window. All of those are talking about spontaneous physical desire for sex. We are reducing sex to a purely physical act when we say and believe things like that. But let's go back to what is really happening during sex. It is the unity of persons. The two become one. Let me read that modification of the Catechism quote I made again. Desire for sex cannot be reduced to the spontaneous outpouring of interior physical impulse. In order to achieve full unity of man and woman, one must have the will to unite with his or her spouse. In order to achieve full unity of man and woman, one must have the will to unite with his or her spouse. Having the will to do something has nothing to do with spontaneous inner impulse. Nothing. Having the will to do something means that you know this is something that is good and desirable to do, even when you don't want to do it. So, like eating healthy. You might will to eat healthy, even though you don't want to. So even though you'd rather eat a piece of chocolate cake, you choose not to because you are willing yourself to eat healthy. Instead, you choose to have some fruit for dessert or skip dessert altogether. Or another example, it is Lent right now when I'm recording this episode. I have a will to do my Lenten sacrifice, but a lot of times I don't want to do it. And sadly, I've already failed several times, but I will to do it. And I keep trying, even when I don't want to, even when I'd rather skip it. Do we do this with sex? Do we have a deep inner will to unite with our spouse in the holy act of sex in order to grow in relationship with our spouse and to deepen our relationship with God by learning more about what our relationship should look like? Maybe you want to just pause the podcast and sit with that question for a little while. What drives your desire to have sex? Do you reduce your desire to have sex to a spontaneous physical desire? Or is your desire to have sex rooted in a deeper desire and will to have and experience unity with your spouse? Now, this is not to say that spontaneous physical desire is wrong. It's a really good thing. Physical desire is meant to point us toward that unity of spouses. It's meant to point us toward that deeper desire and that deeper will to unite. But it's not the only driving factor in desire for sex, and we have got to stop telling ourselves that it is. Guess what? I rarely spontaneously desire to have sex. That is a true fact. I also particularly rarely spontaneously desire to have sex at the same time that my husband spontaneously desires to have sex. Does that mean I say no every time he initiates and I don't feel like it? No. I tap into that deeper desire to have unity with my husband. Does that mean I always say yes? Also, no. Sure, it would be wonderful if I was ready to unite every time that my husband was, but I'm not. Some days truly are too much. Touched out is a real thing. Exhaustion is a real thing. There's all sorts of reasons why my answer is not always yes. But I do say yes sometimes when I'm tired, and I do say yes sometimes when I'm feeling touched out, and I do say yes sometimes when I really don't feel like it, and that is also a very good thing. That is the will to unite with my husband. I do not say yes out of a feeling of coercion or a need to please or appease my husband. I don't say yes out of some misunderstood definition of biblical duty or submission. I say yes when I don't really want to have sex out of a will to unite fully with my husband and grow deeper in relationship with him and with God. That's what I do with my morning prayer time. Would I rather sleep in? Yeah. Would I rather scroll Instagram? A lot of times, yes. Would I rather do any number of things than pull out my Bible and spend time with God? Yeah. But I will to have a deeper relationship with God. I will to grow in holiness through my prayer life. And so I do my prayer time even when I'm exhausted. And I come to it in the most open way possible. But sometimes that's not very open. Sometimes I'm not fully present right away. But the thing is, once I start praying, I'm able to open up and really give that gift of myself to God. Look, ladies, and the gentleman also listening, because I know there's actually a good chunk of you. Sometimes we are able to say yes to sex without being fully present and ready right away. And that has to be okay. If God is okay with our tiny feeble yeses, then our spouse needs to be okay with tiny feeble yeses sometimes. As you get into the act, as foreplay progresses, you will open up. That's the whole point of foreplay, is getting you ready and in the mood to actually be a full and complete gift of self. So it's okay at the beginning of sex if you're not fully there yet. What would the point of foreplay be if you were supposed to be 100% ready for sex the second you started? So to wrap up, I don't say any of this to discount spontaneous physical desire for sex. I say all of this to help you recognize that if you only rely on that physical desire for sex, you are reducing sex to a purely physical act, and that's not at all what sex is. Spontaneous physical desire is a good thing. It can actually help a couple stay out of a rut of not having sex. It is a wonderful thing when one spouse wants sex more than the other because it helps to stretch both of the spouses to look deeper into that will to unite rather than stay at the surface of physical spontaneous desire. I'm going to close this episode by reading you both that original quote from the Catechism again on prayer, and then reading you my modification to make it apply to sex and sexual desire. And I'd really encourage you to take these two quotes to prayer this week and maybe conversation with your spouse. Prayer cannot be reduced to the spontaneous outpouring of interior impulse. In order to pray, one must have the will to pray. Desire for sex cannot be reduced to the spontaneous outpouring of interior physical impulse. In order to achieve full unity of man and woman, one must have the will to unite with his or her spouse. Thanks so much for listening. If you are not already following us on Instagram, be sure to check us out at Charting Toward Intimacy. And if you listen to podcasts on a platform that gives you the option to rate or review, we'd love for you to do that because it helps us spread the word about the podcast. If you ever have questions, comments, or episode topic ideas, please reach out to us. We love to hear from you. You can reach out on Instagram or send us an email. Our email is in the show notes. Until next time.